Nobody was supposed to find them. Emily Sullivan's hands trembled as she pressed them against Max's bloodied chest, watching his amber eyes flutter closed beneath the crumbling Route 66 bridge. It wasn't just her German shepherd dying in her arms. 3 Marines lay bound and broken in the Arizona dust, left to rot like discarded weapons. Sarah's scream echoed through the canyon when she found them. The coffee mug slipped from Frank's weathered fingers, shattering against his trailer steps as he saw Emily cradling Max's still form. The Purple Heart on Frank's mantelpiece caught the desert sun, a reminder of other soldiers who'd never made it home. Just like Emily's father, just like these 3 forgotten Marines who'd trusted the wrong people. "Call 911. Sarah's voice cracked with terror and disbelief. But Emily knew the truth that would haunt them all. Whoever did this was still out there, still watching, still hunting. What had Max died trying to protect them from? And why did the youngest Marine whisper her dead father's name before losing consciousness? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that blood-soaked morning under the bridge, 12-year-old Emily Catherine Sullivan had been talking to a photograph. The faded military portrait of Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan sat on her nightstand, his confident smile frozen behind cracked glass, a daily ritual that kept her father alive in the double-wide trailer they called home. "Dad, Max won't eat again," she whispered to the image, brushing dust from the frame with gentle fingers. "I think he misses Afghanistan as much as I miss you." The German shepherd lay curled in the corner, his distinctive scar cutting a white line across his left eye, a souvenir from an IED blast that had ended both their military careers. Max had been her father's partner, his battle-tested companion who'd sniffed out explosives and saved countless lives. Now, 3 years after Michael's death, Max was a shadow of his former self, refusing to leave their property, jumping at every sound, his amber eyes haunted by memories only he could see. Emily understood that look. She'd seen it in her own mirror every morning since the funeral. Their home in Millbrook, Arizona, sat at the forgotten edge of nowhere, where the desert met abandoned dreams and Route 66 memories. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan worked double shifts, breakfast waitress at Murphy's Diner, night janitor at the medical center, her hands permanently stained with coffee and disinfectant, her smile growing thinner each month as bills piled higher than hope. At 44, Sarah carried grief like a second skeleton, supporting weight that threatened to crush her daily. She'd been Michael's high school sweetheart, the girl who'd waited through 2 deployments and celebrated his safe return, only to lose him to a training accident stateside. The irony tasted bitter as Arizona dust. "We're gonna make it, baby girl," Sarah would say each morning, kissing Emily's forehead before rushing to work. But Emily saw the pill bottles hidden in the medicine cabinet, heard her mother crying behind closed doors when she thought no one was listening. Their guardian angel lived next door in a rusted Airstream trailer. Franklin Morrison, 73 and stubborn as desert sage, had become the grandfather Emily never knew. Frank's Purple Heart sat on his mantelpiece next to unpaid bills and empty whiskey bottles, decorations of a man who'd given everything to his country and received a disability check in return. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam, carrying shrapnel in his chest and secrets in his heart. His weathered hands shook when he drank his morning coffee, but steadied when teaching Emily to change Max's bandages or identify edible desert plants. He'd been quietly selling his military medals and possessions, 1 piece at a time, saving every dollar in an old coffee tin marked Katie's College Fund. The 3 of them formed an unlikely family: the widow, the orphan, the veteran, and the broken dog, bound together by loss and sustained by stubborn love. They were survivors in a place where survival meant everything, unaware that their quiet existence was about to collide with forces darker than any enemy they'd ever imagined. In this forgotten corner of Arizona, where military families came to heal or hide, they thought they'd found safety. They were wrong. Emily woke that morning to the sound she'd been hoping to hear for 18 months. Max, barking with purpose. Not the whimpering nightmare sounds that usually pulled her from sleep, or the anxious panting that followed thunderstorms. This was different. This was the bark of a military working dog who had found something that demanded immediate attention. She rolled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cool linoleum of their double-wide trailer, and padded toward the kitchen where Max stood rigid as a statue. His magnificent German Shepherd frame was coiled with tension she hadn't seen since the day he'd arrived from the military veterinary hospital, broken and haunted by whatever had happened in Afghanistan. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" Emily knelt beside him, following his laser-focused gaze toward the window that faced the old Route 66 bridge. The abandoned concrete structure sat about half a mile away, a relic from when the highway department had rerouted traffic through the new bypass. Now it served mainly as a hangout for teenagers and a dumping ground for appliances that had given up the ghost. But Max wasn't looking at it like a casual observer. His amber eyes, scarred by shrapnel that had ended both his and her father's military careers, were locked onto something only he could detect. His nose worked the air with mechanical precision, processing scents with an intelligence that made Emily's chest tight with memory. This was how he'd looked in her father's deployment videos, alert and focused, every fiber of his being dedicated to the mission. Sarah's voice cut through the morning quiet as she rushed toward the door, car keys jangling in her hand like wind chimes. "Emily, honey, I'm running late for the breakfast shift. Make sure Max gets his medicine and remember what I said about that bridge. It's not safe for kids to play around." Emily wanted to call out to explain that something was different this morning, that Max was trying to tell them something important. But her mother was already gone, the screen door slamming behind her as the beat-up Honda coughed to life in a cloud of desert dust. Max's whining escalated to an almost human sound of distress. He moved to the door and began pawing at the aluminum frame, leaving scratch marks in the metal. Emily had never seen him attempt to leave their property, not once in the 3 years since he'd come home from the war as damaged as she was. From his trailer window next door, Frank Morrison was watching the entire exchange with the sharp attention of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts or die. At 73, his body might be failing, but his mind remained sharp as broken glass. He'd seen that look in war dogs before, the moment when training overrode everything else, when an animal's sixth sense detected what human senses missed. Frank's weathered hand moved instinctively to his chest, feeling the shrapnel that had shifted with his heartbeat for 50 years, a permanent reminder that danger could strike anywhere, any time. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Max suddenly lunged forward with a violence that shocked Emily into stepping back. The screen door's aluminum frame bent and tore as 85 pounds of determined German Shepherd burst through like he was breaching an enemy compound. The sound of ripping metal was sharp and final. There would be no going back from this moment. "Max, no!" "Come back!" Emily's voice cracked as she watched her father's dog, her protector, her best friend, her last connection to the man who'd raised her to be strong, disappearing toward the bridge with more purpose than he'd shown since returning from Afghanistan. Emily grabbed her father's old military radio from the kitchen counter, a habit Frank had taught her for emergencies, and slipped into her hiking boots. The desert sand was already hot beneath her feet as she followed Max's trail, her heart hammering against her ribs with the kind of fear that came from knowing something terrible was about to be discovered. The smell hit her first when she was still 50 yards from the bridge, something chemical and wrong, cutting through the familiar scent of sage and dust like a blade through fabric. It wasn't the usual smell of teenagers' beer bottles or the occasional dead rabbit. This was industrial, medical, the kind of smell that made her think of hospitals and bad news. Max had found something near the concrete barrier, digging frantically at debris that looked deliberately placed. His powerful shoulders rippled beneath his scarred coat as he worked, and Emily could see blood on his paws from clawing at the rocks. Whatever he'd detected, it was urgent enough to drive him past the point of physical comfort. Emily's breath caught in her throat when she saw the boot. Military-issued, desert tan, protruding from beneath chunks of broken concrete like an accusation against the morning sky. Her father had worn boots exactly like that. Every soldier she'd ever met wore boots like that. With shaking hands, she began moving rocks and debris, and what she found beneath them would change everything she thought she knew about her quiet corner of Arizona, about her father's death, and about how far some people would go to keep their secrets buried in the desert heat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete when Emily first heard Max's low growl turn into something she'd never heard before, a sound that made her blood freeze. It wasn't the usual whimper of nightmares or the anxious panting that followed thunderstorms. This was different. This was the sound of a warrior awakening. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" Emily knelt beside him, watching his ears pivot toward the old Route 66 bridge like radar dishes, searching for enemy signals. His whole body had gone rigid, muscles coiled beneath his scarred coat, amber eyes fixed on something only he could detect. For 18 months, Max had refused to leave their property. Now he was pressing against the screen door with an urgency that made Emily's heart race. The German shepherd's breathing quickened, his nose working the air with mechanical precision. Emily had read about military working dogs in her father's journals, how they could smell fear, detect explosives, sense danger from miles away. Max's training hadn't disappeared with his retirement. It had been buried under trauma and grief, waiting for the right moment to resurface. "Sarah!" Emily called, but her mother was already rushing toward the door, car keys jangling in her hand, coffee splashing from her travel mug. The morning shift at Murphy's Diner wouldn't wait, and they couldn't afford for her to be late again. "What's all the commotion?" Sarah paused, noticing Max's strange behavior. The dog was now pawing at the door frame, leaving scratch marks in the aluminum. His tail wasn't wagging. It was standing straight up like a warning flag. "He keeps staring at the bridge," Emily explained, pointing toward the distant concrete structure that spanned Willow Creek. The old bridge had been abandoned when the highway department rerouted traffic through the new bypass. Now it served as a hangout for teenagers and a dumping ground for broken dreams and rusty appliances. Sarah checked her watch and sighed. "Honey, it's probably just a coyote. Max gets spooked by wildlife, remember? I've got to run, but promise me you won't go wandering off. That bridge isn't safe." Before Emily could respond, Sarah was gone, her beat-up Honda disappearing in a cloud of desert dust. Emily looked down at Max, whose whining had escalated to an almost human sound of distress. He was staring at her now, those intelligent eyes pleading with an intensity that made her stomach clench. From his trailer window, Frank Morrison had been watching the entire exchange. At 73, his instincts remained sharp as broken glass. He'd seen that look in War Dogs before, the moment when training overrode everything else, when an animal's sixth sense detected what human senses missed. Frank's hand instinctively moved to his chest, feeling the shrapnel that still shifted with each heartbeat, a permanent reminder that danger could strike anywhere, anytime. Max suddenly lunged forward, breaking through the screen door with a violence that shocked Emily. The metal frame bent and tore as 85 pounds of determined German shepherd burst through like he was breaching an enemy compound. He didn't run. He moved with purpose, his slight limp barely slowing his steady advance toward the bridge. "Max! No! Come back!" Emily's voice cracked as she chased after him, her bare feet hitting the hot sand. But Max was already 50 yards ahead, moving with more energy and determination than he'd shown since returning from Afghanistan. Frank emerged from his trailer, grabbing his old medical kit, a habit from Vietnam that had never left him. His bad heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Emily disappearing toward the bridge, following a dog who might be leading them all into danger. The smell hit Emily first, something chemical and wrong, cutting through the desert air like a blade. It wasn't the usual scent of sage and dust. This was industrial, medical, the kind of smell that made her think of hospitals and bad news. Max had found something near the concrete barrier, digging frantically at debris that looked deliberately placed. Emily's breath caught in her throat when she saw the boot. Military-issued, desert tan, protruding from beneath chunks of broken concrete. Her father had worn boots exactly like that. Every soldier she'd ever met wore boots like that. "Oh, God," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside Max. The dog had uncovered more than just a boot. There was a leg attached to it, and the leg belonged to someone who was still breathing. With shaking hands, Emily began moving rocks and debris, revealing not one, but 3 men in military uniforms. They were young, maybe mid-20s, with faces that reminded her of her father's unit photos. Their hands were zip-tied behind their backs, mouths covered with duct tape, eyes swollen shut from what looked like systematic beatings. The first Marine she uncovered had captain's bars on his collar. Despite his injuries, he was conscious, his dark eyes tracking her movement with desperate hope. When she gently pulled the tape from his mouth, he gasped like a drowning man finding air. "Help us," he whispered through split lips. "They're coming back." "Who's coming back?" Emily's voice was barely audible, but the Marine's eyes widened with recognition when he focused on her face. "Sullivan," he breathed, reading the name embroidered on her father's old Army t-shirt. "Your dad, Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan. He saved my unit in Kandahar." Emily's world tilted. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. These Marines knew her father, and somehow that knowledge had led them here, to this abandoned bridge, to torture and near death. Frank arrived just as Emily was uncovering the second Marine, a young Asian man who wasn't moving. Frank took one look at the scene, and his Vietnam training kicked in, overriding his failing heart and arthritic joints. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, kneeling beside the unconscious Marine to check his pulse. "This is professional work. Systematic. Someone wanted information from these boys." The third Marine was stirring, mumbling through his gag. When Emily freed his mouth, he immediately looked around with wild eyes before focusing on her. "Little girl," he gasped, "you need to run. Now. They said they'd be back by noon to finish us." Emily checked her watch. 11:30 a.m. Frank was already assessing injuries with the efficiency of a battlefield medic. "They're dehydrated. Probably been here 2 days minimum. This one has internal bleeding," he indicated the unconscious Marine. "We can't move them without risking their lives." "Then we don't move them," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We get help here." "Emily," Frank's voice carried a warning. "Whoever did this has inside information. They knew where to find active-duty Marines, knew how to take them without anyone noticing. This isn't some random crime." Max had positioned himself between Emily and the approach to the bridge, his ears alert for the sound of returning vehicles. His military training was fully activated now, every sense focused on protecting his pack. Emily looked at the 3 broken Marines, at Frank with his hand pressed to his racing heart, at Max standing guard like a 4-legged soldier. She thought of her father, of his motto, "Never leave a soldier behind." "We're not running," she said quietly. "Dad didn't run in Afghanistan. I won't run in Arizona." In the distance, the sound of engines echoed off the canyon walls. The sound of approaching engines sent Max into full combat mode, his body language transforming from pet to protector in seconds. Emily had never seen him like this. Every muscle coiled, ears forward, eyes scanning the horizon with lethal focus. This was the dog who had saved her father's life in Afghanistan, the warrior who had been buried beneath grief and trauma for 3 long years. "Get them into the drainage culvert," Frank commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a battlefield commander despite his labored breathing. The concrete pipe ran beneath the bridge, hidden from view, but large enough to shelter all of them. "Emily, help me drag them. We've got maybe 2 minutes." Captain James Rodriguez, the first Marine Emily had freed, struggled to help despite his zip-tied hands and broken ribs. "The tall one," he gasped, nodding toward the unconscious Asian Marine. "That's Corporal David Chen. He took the worst of it because he wouldn't talk." Emily grabbed Chen under his arms while Frank took his legs. The young Marine was dead weight, his breathing shallow and erratic. Blood stained the front of his uniform, and his face was a canvas of purple bruises. Whatever information their captors had wanted, Chen had died rather than give it up. The third Marine, Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, was already trying to crawl toward the culvert despite his injuries. "Bobby," he introduced himself through gritted teeth. "Your dad pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Kandahar, took shrapnel that should have killed me." Emily's hands shook as she helped drag the Marines to safety. 3 men who had served with her father, who carried pieces of his story she'd never heard, were now depending on her 12-year-old hands to save their lives. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like desert heat. Max disappeared from view, his tactical instincts drawing him toward the approaching vehicles. Emily could hear him moving through the brush with ghost-like silence, positioning himself for reconnaissance. The dog's military training was fully operational now, overriding years of PTSD with pure combat instinct. 2 black SUVs crested the ridge, their windows tinted dark as midnight. Emily pressed herself against the concrete wall of the culvert, one hand on Chen's chest to monitor his breathing, the other clutching her father's old military radio that Frank had given her for emergencies. No signal this deep in the canyon, but the familiar weight comforted her anyway. "Stay quiet," Frank whispered, his medical kit open beside him as he worked to stop Chen's internal bleeding with battlefield efficiency. His hands moved with muscle memory from Vietnam, steady despite his fear. "These aren't local thugs. This is military-grade operation." Through the drainage opening, Emily watched boots hit the ground, 5 men in tactical gear, moving with coordinated precision. Their leader was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing desert camouflage that looked government-issued. When he turned, Emily could see his profile. A man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes like winter storms. "Marcus Davidson," Rodriguez whispered so quietly Emily almost didn't hear. "Former Marine captain. My father." Emily's blood turned to ice water. The man who had tortured these Marines, who had left them to die in the desert heat, was the father of one of his victims. The complexity of that betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Marcus Davidson called out in a voice that carried military authority, "James, I know you're out there, son. This doesn't have to end badly. Just give me the information and we can all go home." Rodriguez pressed his face against Emily's shoulder, his whole body shaking. "He wasn't always like this," he whispered. "Mom died in a car wreck while he was deployed. Lost everything. Came back broken and angry." "What information?" Emily mouthed silently. "Trafficking routes," Hayes answered, his voice barely audible. "We discovered a network using old military supply lines, veterans, active duty, contractors, all in on it. Your father was investigating it when he died." Emily's world tilted again. Her father hadn't died in a training accident. He'd been murdered for getting too close to something that reached into the highest levels of military and government. The official story, the folded flag, the sympathy cards, all of it had been lies. Max's warning bark echoed from the ridge above. Not his usual sound, but a specific tactical signal Emily had heard her father use in training videos. Enemy approaching from the north. 2 vehicles, 5 hostiles, armed and moving with military precision. "Smart dog," Frank muttered, checking his old service pistol. "Still remembers his job." Marcus Davidson's voice carried a note of impatience now. "James, your friends are dying. The longer you make me wait, the worse this gets for everyone." Rodriguez struggled to sit up straighter. "He's not bluffing. He's got other hostages, families of Marines who got too close. That's how he keeps people quiet." Emily felt rage building in her chest, hot and pure. This man had destroyed families, corrupted the military her father had died serving, turned soldiers against each other for money and power. The same uniform her father had worn with honor was being used as camouflage for evil. "We need Sarah," Emily whispered. "She's the only one who can reach the right people." Frank pulled out his ancient flip phone, but Emily could see from his expression that there was no signal. They were trapped in a dead zone, cut off from help, with 3 dying Marines and a madman closing in. Chen stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. When he focused on Emily, his split lips formed a single word: "Run." "No," Emily said firmly. "Dad's motto, never leave a soldier behind." The sound of boots on concrete grew closer. Marcus Davidson was methodically searching the bridge structure, his men spreading out in a practiced sweep pattern. Military efficiency turned toward hunting his own son and anyone stupid enough to help him. Max appeared at the mouth of the culvert, panting hard but moving silently. Blood stained his left front paw, not his own. He'd engaged the enemy and returned to report. In his mouth he carried something that made Emily's heart stop: a cell phone with government clearance codes on the screen. "Good boy," Frank breathed, taking the phone. "You magnificent bastard. You got us communications." Emily watched Frank's weathered fingers work the keypad with surprising dexterity. He wasn't just calling 911, he was accessing military emergency frequencies, calling in favors from a war fought 50 years ago, reaching out to a network of aging veterans who still remembered what honor meant. "Frank Morrison, 1st Infantry Division, Vietnam," he spoke quietly into the phone. "I need immediate extraction for 3 wounded Marines and 1 civilian. Coordinates 34.7 north, 112.3 west. Military contractor gone rogue, multiple casualties expected." Marcus Davidson's voice carried from directly above them now. "I can wait all day, James, but your friends can't." Rodriguez met Emily's eyes in the dim light of the culvert. "If something happens to me," he whispered, "tell people the truth about what we found. Don't let them cover this up like they did your father's death." Emily felt something shift inside her, some fundamental change from child to guardian. These men had served with her father, had carried his memory across battlefields and back home again. Now they needed her to be strong the way Michael Sullivan had been strong. "Nobody else dies today," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same determination that had gotten her father through 2 tours of duty. "Max, can you create a distraction?" The German shepherd's ears perked up. Emily had never given him a tactical command before, but the dog seemed to understand. He looked at Frank, who nodded slowly. "Stay away from the north approach," Frank advised. "Hit them from the east, make noise, then circle back here. Don't engage directly, just give us time to move." Max's tail gave one sharp wag, acknowledgement received, and then he was gone, padding silently through the drainage pipe toward the far end where it opened near the creek bed. Emily helped Frank prepare Chen for transport. The young Marine was conscious now, but weak. His breathing labored. Hayes was trying to work feeling back into his zip-tied hands, and Rodriguez was struggling to stand despite his injuries. "When Max makes his move," Emily said, "we head for Frank's truck. It's got military radio equipment. We can coordinate with whoever Frank called." Above them, Marcus Davidson was losing patience. "James, last chance. Give me the evidence or I start shooting your friends." Emily felt her father's dog tags pressing against her chest. She'd worn them every day since the funeral. Michael Sullivan had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was action in spite of fear. Max's howl split the morning air from the eastern ridge, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting metal. Shouts erupted from Davidson's men as they rushed toward the sound, leaving the bridge temporarily undefended. "Now!" Frank commanded. Emily helped Rodriguez to his feet while Frank supported Chen's other side. Hayes crawled behind them, still working to free his hands. Together, they emerged from the culvert into blazing Arizona sunlight, moving as fast as 3 wounded Marines and 2 civilians could manage. Frank's truck waited 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 50 miles. Emily could hear Davidson's men shouting, regrouping, realizing they'd been deceived. Max had bought them maybe 2 minutes before the hunt resumed. "Come on," Emily urged, half carrying Rodriguez while Frank struggled with Chen's dead weight. "We're almost there." Behind them, Marcus Davidson's voice rang out with military fury. "Find them! No one leaves this canyon alive!" The race for survival had begun. Frank's truck engine roared to life just as the first bullets shattered the rear windshield. Emily threw herself across Chen's unconscious body, feeling glass fragments rain down on her back like deadly confetti. Rodriguez pressed his face into the floorboard, his zip-tied hands making it impossible to protect himself properly. "Stay down!" Frank shouted, gunning the engine as more shots peppered the truck bed. His military driving training from Vietnam kicked in, taking the vehicle off-road through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. The suspension screamed in protest as they bounced over rocks and gullies, but Frank kept them moving away from Davidson's kill zone. Emily's world had narrowed to the sound of Chen's labored breathing and the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. This young Marine, barely older than her high school cousins, was dying in her arms while his own commanding officer's father hunted them like animals. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "Radio!" Rodriguez gasped, pointing toward the communications equipment mounted under Frank's dashboard. "Call? Base? Tell them?" Frank's weathered hands worked the military frequency controls while steering one-handed through a maze of desert scrub. "Bravo, Base. This is November 7, requesting immediate assistance. We have 3 wounded Marines under fire from hostile forces." The response crackled through static. "November 7, state your identity and current situation." "Frank Morrison, 1st Infantry Division, retired. I've got Captain Rodriguez, Corporal Chen, and Staff Sergeant Hayes, all requiring immediate medical evacuation. They were taken by Marcus Davidson, former Marine captain gone rogue." A long pause, then, "November 7, Marcus Davidson is listed as killed in action 3 years ago." Emily felt her blood turn to ice. If Davidson was officially dead, then whoever was hunting them didn't exist in any government database. They were being pursued by a ghost, a man with no identity and nothing left to lose. "Bullshit," Frank snarled into the radio. "Davidson is very much alive and running a trafficking operation using military resources. These Marines discovered his network and got tortured for it." Rodriguez grabbed Emily's arm with zip-tied hands, his eyes urgent. "The evidence," he whispered. "In my boot. Hidden compartment. Everything we found about the network." Emily worked frantically to remove Rodriguez's combat boot while Frank navigated through a narrow canyon that would either hide them or trap them completely. Her fingers found the secret compartment, a hollowed-out section containing a micro SD card sealed in waterproof plastic. "Got it," she breathed, tucking the card into her father's dog tags for safekeeping. Behind them, the sound of approaching engines echoed off canyon walls. Hedda Davidson's SUVs were closing the gap, their superior horsepower making up for Frank's head start. Emily could see dust clouds rising like smoke signals of approaching death. Max appeared suddenly on a ridge above them, keeping pace with the truck despite his limp. The German Shepherd was moving with purpose, scouting ahead, using terrain to his advantage like the war dog he'd once been. When he barked twice, short, sharp signals, Frank immediately turned the wheel hard left. "Dog's got better tactical sense than most officers I knew," Frank muttered, following Max's guidance into a narrow ravine that would be invisible from the air. The respite was temporary. Within minutes, Emily heard the whine of helicopter rotors cutting through desert silence. Davidson had called in air support, probably using his old military contacts to requisition aircraft under false pretenses. "We're trapped," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of a soldier who'd seen too many battles end badly. Emily looked at the 3 Marines who had served with her father, at Frank, whose heart was failing under stress, at Max, who was pushing his injured body beyond its limits to protect them all. These were the people who mattered. Not the faceless bureaucrats who would cover up another military scandal, not the politicians who would trade lives for convenience, but the warriors who remembered what honor meant. "No," she said firmly, "we're not trapped. We're taking the fight to them." Frank's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Emily, you're 12 years old." "I'm Michael Sullivan's daughter," she replied, and something in her voice made all 3 Marines look at her with new respect. "Dad taught me that tactical advantage isn't about size or numbers. It's about knowing the terrain and using your enemy's expectations against them." Chen stirred slightly, his eyes focusing on Emily with difficulty. "What? What do you have in mind?" Emily studied the ravine around them, remembering countless hours spent exploring these canyons with Max, learning every cave and hidden passage. "Davidson expects us to run. Instead, we're going to disappear." She directed Frank toward a section of the canyon where flash floods had carved deep caves into the rock face. These weren't marked on any military maps. Local knowledge passed down through generations of kids who'd used them as hideouts and secret forts. "Park behind that boulder formation," Emily instructed. "We'll be invisible from the air, and there's only one ground approach. Classic defensive position." Frank followed her guidance, easing the truck into a natural shelter that had probably hidden Apache warriors from cavalry patrols a century before. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They were using the same tactics indigenous people had used against military forces that considered the desert their property. Max bounded down from the ridge, his tongue lolling but his eyes alert. He'd been running reconnaissance for over an hour, and Emily could see the toll it was taking on his old injury. But the dog showed no sign of stopping. His pack was in danger, and he would defend them until his heart gave out. "Radio's getting interference," Frank reported. "Either they're jamming us or the canyon walls are blocking transmission." Rodriguez struggled to sit up straighter. "Davidson's got government contractors on his payroll. They can make communications disappear, create dead zones where they need them." Emily felt the weight of the micro SD card against her chest. The evidence these Marines had died to collect was now her responsibility, and she understood with crystal clarity that powerful people would kill anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. The helicopter sound was getting closer, echoing off canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the aircraft's location. Davidson's voice came through a loudspeaker, distorted but recognizable. "James, you're only making this harder on everyone. Surrender now, and I'll make sure your friends receive proper medical attention." Liar, Rodriguez whispered, his face twisted with pain and betrayal. He'll execute all of us the moment we show ourselves. Emily looked at her unlikely family, 3 broken Marines, an aging veteran with a failing heart, and a war dog pushed beyond his limits. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a canyon that could become their tomb. But they had something Davidson's forces lacked. They were fighting for each other, not for money or power. Frank, can you reach your Vietnam contacts on that radio? Maybe, if I can get a clear signal. Then do it. Tell them we need a full military response, not just a rescue. This network Davidson's running, it's bigger than just these 3 Marines. If we don't stop it here, it continues forever. Chen managed a weak smile. You really are Sullivan's kid. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its rotor wash stirring up dust clouds that provided temporary concealment. Emily could hear Davidson's men rappelling down, their boots hitting rock with military precision. They had minutes, maybe less, before the final confrontation. Emily knelt beside Max, looking into his amber eyes that had seen combat in Afghanistan and trauma in Arizona. One more mission, boy. Can you do it? Max's tail gave a single determined wag. Frank's radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission. November 7, this is Bravo Base. We're showing multiple unauthorized aircraft in your area. A military response is inbound, ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. Emily could hear Davidson's team moving through the ravine with tactical efficiency, their training and equipment giving them every advantage except one. They didn't know this terrain the way she did. Rodriguez, she said quietly, when I signal, you and Hayes create noise from the north side. Make them think we're trying to break out that way. What about you and Chen? Emily looked at the unconscious Marine whose courage had gotten him tortured rather than break under questioning. We're going to make sure that evidence gets to people who still believe in justice. The final battle for Route 66 bridge was about to begin, and Emily Sullivan was no longer a frightened child hiding from danger. She was her father's daughter, and she understood that some things were worth fighting for, even if you might not survive the fight. Outside their shelter, Marcus Davidson's voice echoed with finality. James, this is your last chance. Come out now, or we come in shooting. Emily gripped her father's dog tags, feeling the micro SD card pressed between the metal surfaces. Let them come. The first shot echoed through the canyon like thunder, and Emily watched Frank Morrison crumple against the truck's tailgate, his weathered hand pressed to his chest where blood was already seeping through his flannel shirt. His Purple Heart medal caught the desert sun one final time before falling into the dust beside him. Grandpa Frank! Emily's scream tore from her throat as she crawled toward him, but Rodriguez grabbed her with his zip-tied hands, pulling her back behind the boulder formation. Frank's eyes found hers across the 10 feet that might as well have been 10 miles. Katie, he whispered, his voice already growing weak. Coffee tin, under my bed, for college. Don't talk like that, Emily sobbed, but she could see the truth in his fading gaze. The shrapnel in Frank's chest, carried for 50 years since Vietnam, had finally shifted with the impact. His body was shutting down, and they all knew it. Marcus Davidson stepped into view, his service pistol still smoking. Behind him, 4 tactical operators spread out with military precision, their weapons trained on the remaining survivors. Emily had seen her father's unit photos enough times to recognize the coordinated movement of professional soldiers turned mercenary. That was unnecessary, Marcus, Rodriguez called out, his voice breaking with grief and rage. Frank was a decorated veteran. Frank was a liability, Davidson replied coldly. Just like your father was a liability, James. Just like everyone who gets too close to understanding how the world really works. Emily felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Frank Morrison had been the closest thing to a grandfather she'd ever known. He taught her to change Max's bandages, to identify desert plants, to believe that broken things could still be beautiful. Now he was bleeding out in Arizona dust while his killer talked about liability assessments. Chen stirred against her shoulder, his eyes fluttering open just long enough to see Frank's still form. "No," he breathed, and Emily could hear his heart breaking too. These Marines had been prepared for combat, for capture, for torture. They hadn't been prepared to watch innocent people die because they'd tried to help. Max appeared on the ridge above Davidson's position, moving with deadly silence, despite his injuries. The German Shepherd had positioned himself for a flanking attack, using terrain and shadow to approach unseen. Emily could see the predatory focus in his amber eyes. This was no longer a rescue dog or a PTSD survivor. This was a weapon of war, preparing to engage enemy forces. "The evidence, James," Davidson continued, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Give me the micro SD card, and I'll make the rest of this quick and painless." Rodriguez met Emily's eyes with a look that conveyed volumes. They both understood that Davidson would kill them all regardless of cooperation. The only question was whether their deaths would serve any purpose beyond satisfying a madman's need for closure. Frank's breathing had become shallow and erratic, but his hand was still moving, reaching toward something in his jacket pocket. Emily watched him pull out an old military radio, not the truck's communication system, but a personal emergency beacon he'd carried since Vietnam. With his last conscious act, Frank Morrison activated the beacon and spoke into it with voice barely above a whisper. "Mayday, Mayday. Frank Morrison, 1st Infantry Division. Multiple casualties at Route 66 Bridge. Tell my Katie. Tell her Grandpa Frank kept his promise." The transmission cut off as Frank's hand fell to his side. Emily felt the last anchor to her childhood snap as the man who'd been her protector and teacher drew his final breath under the merciless Arizona sun. Davidson's voice carried a note of impatience. "Touching scene, but we're on a schedule. James, you have 30 seconds to produce that evidence." Emily looked at the 3 Marines who had served with her father, at Max preparing for what might be his final battle, at Frank's still form growing cold in the desert heat. Everything good and decent in her world was being destroyed by men who wore the same uniform her father had died serving. "I have the evidence," she called out, her 12-year-old voice somehow steady despite the grief threatening to crush her. "But I want to know something first." Davidson's tactical team shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with taking orders that involved murdering children and veterans. Emily could see doubt creeping into their postures, the kind of moral conflict that destroyed unit cohesion. "You want to know about your father," Davidson said, his voice taking on an almost gentle tone. "Michael Sullivan was a good soldier, Emily. But he got curious about things that weren't his concern. He was investigating your trafficking network. He was investigating a vital national security operation that used unconventional methods to fund covert activities. Your father couldn't understand that sometimes we have to work in gray areas to protect American interests." Emily felt rage building in her chest, hot and pure as desert fire. "You're selling people like livestock and calling it patriotism. I'm using enemy resources to fund operations that Congress won't approve. Those trafficking victims, they're mostly illegal immigrants and criminals who would disappear into the system anyway. We're just making their disappearance profitable for America." Rodriguez retched at his father's casual justification of mass murder. "Jesus Christ, Dad, do you even hear yourself?" "I hear a son who's forgotten that war requires sacrifice," Davidson replied. "Your grandfather died fighting communists in Korea. I fought terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan. You were supposed to continue that legacy, not betray it for some misguided sense of conventional morality." Emily realized with crystal clarity that Davidson genuinely believed his own twisted logic. He'd convinced himself that selling human beings was somehow serving his country, that murder and torture were acceptable tools of patriotism. The man wasn't just evil. He was insane with grief and rage that had curdled into something monstrous. Max chose that moment to strike. The German Shepherd launched himself from the ridge with deadly precision, 80 pounds of trained war dog crashing into the nearest tactical operator. The man's scream echoed through the canyon as Max's teeth found his weapon arm, disarming him with surgical efficiency. Chaos erupted as Davidson's remaining men tried to engage a target that moved like liquid shadow through the rocks. Max had reverted completely to his military programming, using guerrilla tactics that turned the canyon into his personal killing field. Emily used the distraction to help Rodriguez move Chen to better cover, while Hayes finally managed to free his hands from the zip ties. The staff sergeant immediately began checking Frank's body for weapons and ammunition, his training overriding his grief. "Emily," Rodriguez gasped, "whatever happens, that evidence has to survive. Too many people have died for it." She nodded, feeling the micro SD card pressed against her chest like a talisman. Her father's investigation, Frank's sacrifice, these Marines' torture. All of it would be meaningless if Davidson's network continued operating. A gunshot rang out, followed by Max's yelp of pain. Emily's heart stopped as she saw her father's dog stumbling, blood streaming from a graze along his ribs. Max had been hurt, but he was still moving, still fighting, still protecting his pack with everything he had left. Davidson's voice cut through the gunfire. "Enough! James, call off the dog or I start executing his friends one by one." Emily could see they had captured Hayes, using him as a human shield while they regrouped. The staff sergeant's face was calm despite the gun pressed to his head. He'd accepted his fate with the resignation of a professional soldier. "Don't do it," Hayes called out. "Complete the mission. That's an order." Emily felt the weight of command settling on her 12-year-old shoulders. 3 Marines were looking to her for leadership, trusting her with decisions that would determine who lived and who died. She was no longer Michael Sullivan's little girl. She was the commanding officer in a war that had already cost too much. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the canyon, but Emily couldn't tell if they were rescue or reinforcement for Davidson's forces. Either way, the final confrontation was approaching, and she had to decide whether to surrender the evidence that had cost so many lives or watch more good people die for principles that seemed increasingly abstract in the face of immediate mortality. Frank's emergency beacon continued broadcasting from beside his still form, an electronic prayer for salvation that might or might not be heard by anyone who cared about justice. In the distance, Max howled, a sound of grief and defiance that echoed off canyon walls like a battle cry. The helicopters approaching from the north weren't rescue aircraft, they were military gunships, and Emily's heart sank as she recognized the insignia of Davidson's old unit. He'd called in favors from corrupt contacts, turning legitimate military resources into tools for covering up his crimes. The sound of rotor blades chopping through desert air carried the promise of overwhelming firepower and no witnesses left alive. "Those aren't the good guys," Rodriguez whispered, his face pale as he recognized the aircraft configuration. "Dad's got friends in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. They think they're supporting a legitimate counter-terrorism operation." Emily felt the crushing weight of betrayal within betrayal. Davidson wasn't just using criminals and mercenaries. He was manipulating honorable soldiers into becoming accessories to mass murder. How many good people had unknowingly helped his trafficking network because they trusted their former commanding officer? Max limped back toward their position, blood matting his fur where the bullet had grazed his ribs. The German Shepherd's amber eyes held an intelligence that transcended animal instinct. He understood they were surrounded, outgunned, and rapidly running out of options. But he also understood that surrender meant death for everyone he'd sworn to protect. Davidson's voice carried over a loudspeaker from one of the helicopters. "Final offer, James. Surrender now and I'll ensure your friends receive proper military burials with full honors. Continue this resistance and their bodies will never be found." Emily looked at the micro SD card in her hands, smaller than her thumbnail, but containing enough evidence to destroy a network that had tortured and murdered dozens of people. Her father had died collecting this information. Frank had sacrificed his life protecting it. 3 Marines had endured systematic torture rather than reveal its location. "Rodriguez," she said quietly, "if something happens to me, how do I make sure this evidence reaches the right people?" The Marine captain managed a weak smile despite their desperate circumstances. "Your dad taught you well. Even under fire, you're thinking about mission completion." Chen stirred against Emily's shoulder, his consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. When his eyes focused on her face, he whispered something that made her blood freeze. Not the only copy." "What do you mean?" "Backup. Your house. Frank's radio. Been transmitting. For months." Emily's mind reeled as she understood the implications. Frank Morrison hadn't just been an aging veteran drinking away his Vietnam memories. He'd been actively investigating Davidson's network, using his old military contacts to gather intelligence. The radio equipment in his trailer wasn't just for emergency communications. It had been broadcasting evidence to off-site locations for months. "The coffee tin," she breathed, remembering Frank's dying words about money for college. It wasn't just savings. He was documenting everything. Rodriguez nodded weakly. "Frank was your dad's backup plan. When Michael got too close and they killed him, Frank took over the investigation. He's been feeding information to a Pentagon task force for 2 years." The revelation hit Emily like physical blow. Frank Morrison had been risking his life every day to continue her father's work, and she'd never known. Every time she'd seen him drinking on his porch, he'd actually been processing intelligence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of military and government. Above them, the helicopters were taking positions for a coordinated strike. Emily could see repelling equipment being prepared. Within minutes, Special Forces soldiers would be dropping into the canyon with orders to eliminate all witnesses to Davidson's operation. "Emily," Hayes called from his position as human shield, "whatever you're planning, do it now. Those gunships have enough firepower to level this entire canyon." She looked at Max, whose intelligent eyes seemed to understand the impossible situation. The dog had already sacrificed everything for his pack, his health, his safety, his chance at a peaceful retirement. Now he was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that her father's mission succeeded. "Max," she whispered, "can you get to Frank's trailer?" The German shepherd's ears perked up. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, he understood what she was asking. Frank's radio equipment was their only hope of transmitting the evidence to people who could act on it before Davidson's forces eliminated all traces of the investigation. Emily attached the micro SD card to Max's collar, using her father's dog tags as a protective case. "Take this home, boy. Find the coffee tin. Transmit everything to Frank's Pentagon contacts." Max whined softly, reluctant to leave her in danger. Emily had never asked him to abandon his protective position before. It went against every instinct the military had trained into him. "Go," she commanded, using the voice of authority her father had taught her. "That's an order, soldier." Max's tail gave one final wag of acknowledgement, and then he was gone, disappearing through terrain that would be impossible for human pursuers to follow. Emily watched her father's dog, her best friend, her protector, her last connection to better times, vanish into the desert carrying the evidence that dozens of people had died to protect. Davidson's voice crackled over the radio. "James, I've been monitoring your communications. That dog won't make it to the highway, and even if he does, Frank's equipment was disabled yesterday. You're fighting for nothing." Emily felt despair settling over her like desert heat. If Frank's radio was compromised, then Max was running toward a trap instead of salvation. Davidson had been planning this endgame for months, accounting for every possible escape route and backup plan. But Rodriguez squeezed her hand with fingers that barely had strength left. "He's lying," the Marine whispered. "Standard psychological warfare. Make the enemy think resistance is hopeless." Chen managed to lift his head slightly. "Frank's equipment. Military grade. Can't be. Disabled remotely. Has to be. Physically destroyed." Emily realized Davidson was trying to break their morale by making them believe their sacrifice would be meaningless. But Frank Morrison had been too smart, too experienced, to leave his investigation vulnerable to electronic interference. The old Vietnam veteran had built redundancies into redundancies, ensuring that his intelligence network would survive, even if he didn't. The sound of repelling soldiers echoed off canyon walls as Davidson's forces began their final assault. Emily counted at least 8 operators descending on tactical ropes, moving with the precision of Special Forces units who believed they were serving their country. "When they get close," Rodriguez said quietly, "I want you to surrender." "What?" "You're a 12-year-old civilian. Even corrupted soldiers won't execute a child in cold blood. Not immediately. That gives you time to explain what's really happening here." Emily understood his strategy, but it required her to trust that Davidson's forces retained enough humanity to hesitate before murdering a little girl. Given everything she'd witnessed about their willingness to torture and kill, that seemed like a dangerous gamble. Hayes caught her eye from his position with a gun to his head. The staff sergeant mouthed words she could barely make out. "Tell them about your father." She nodded, understanding. These soldiers descending into the canyon had served under Davidson's command. They would have known her father, Michael Sullivan, and respected his service record. If she could make them understand that they were being used to cover up his murder, maybe some of them would remember what honor meant. The first tactical operator landed 20 feet from their position, his weapon trained but his finger off the trigger. Emily could see his face through the tactical goggles, young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he still believed in serving something greater than himself. "Military personnel, identify yourselves," he called out, following rules of engagement that required him to verify targets before firing. Emily stood slowly, her hands visible and empty. "My name is Emily Sullivan. My father was Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan, killed 3 years ago while investigating a trafficking network run by Marcus Davidson." The soldier's weapon wavered slightly. Behind his goggles she could see recognition and confusion warring in his expression. "Sullivan's kid?" another voice called from above. "Mike Sullivan, who saved half the battalion in Kandahar?" Emily felt a spark of hope. Her father's reputation had survived his death, and these soldiers remembered him as a hero. If she could make them understand that Davidson had murdered their comrade and was now using them to cover it up, maybe the truth would finally have a fighting chance. "My father discovered that Davidson was using military resources to traffic human beings," she continued, her young voice carrying across the canyon with surprising strength. "These Marines were tortured because they found evidence of the same network. Davidson killed my father, and now he's trying to kill them." Above them, Marcus Davidson's voice carried a note of desperate fury. "Ignore the child. She's been brainwashed by insurgent propaganda. Complete your mission." But Emily could see doubt spreading through the assault team like wildfire. Professional soldiers who had served with honor were being asked to execute fellow Marines and a child to protect their former commanding officer's criminal enterprise. The moral foundation of Davidson's operation was cracking, and Emily pressed her advantage with everything her father had taught her about leadership under fire. The young tactical operator lowered his weapon completely when Emily showed him her father's dog tags. the metal worn smooth from 3 years of constant wear against her chest. Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan's name was etched in letters that caught the desert sunlight, and the soldier's face went pale behind his tactical goggles. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "you really are Sullivan's little girl. He carried your picture with him everywhere. Used to show everyone photos of you at your school science fair." Emily felt tears threatening but forced them back. This wasn't time for grief. It was time for justice. "My dad was murdered because he discovered what Davidson was really doing with those supply runs. These Marines found the same evidence, and now Davidson wants to kill them too." The soldier, his name tape read Martinez, keyed his radio with shaking hands. "Command, this is Bravo 2. We have a situation down here. Request immediate stand down on current operation." Davidson's voice crackled back with barely controlled rage. "Martinez, you will complete your assigned mission or face court-martial for insubordination." "Sir, with respect, if this is Michael Sullivan's daughter, then we need to reassess the intelligence briefing. Sullivan died serving this country, and his family deserves protection, not elimination." Emily watched as moral conflict tore through Davidson's assault team. These weren't mercenaries or criminals. They were professional soldiers who had signed up to protect American civilians, not murder them. The cognitive dissonance of being ordered to execute a child whose father they'd served alongside was destroying their unit cohesion. From the helicopter above, Davidson's voice carried desperation masked as authority. "That child is a security threat who has been compromised by enemy propaganda. She's carrying intelligence that threatens ongoing operations vital to national security." Martinez looked at Emily with eyes full of painful recognition. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to surrender any materials you might be carrying. This can all be resolved peacefully if you cooperate." Emily felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She could surrender, trust that these soldiers would protect her once they understood the full truth, or she could continue fighting for evidence that might already be compromised. Either choice could result in more deaths. Rodriguez made the decision for her. Despite his injuries and zip-tied hands, the Marine captain struggled to his feet and addressed Martinez with the authority of his rank. "Sergeant, I am Captain James Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. These men are my unit, and we have been held prisoner and tortured for intelligence regarding a classified investigation. I am ordering you to provide immediate medical evacuation and secure communications with Pentagon oversight." Martinez snapped to attention instinctively, muscle memory responding to legitimate military authority. But his confusion was evident as he looked between Rodriguez and the helicopter, where Davidson was screaming orders. "Sir, Captain Rodriguez is listed as missing in action, possibly killed by insurgent forces. Command says you're being impersonated by enemy combatants." "Sergeant," Rodriguez said quietly, "look at my face. Look at what they did to me and my men. Does this look like insurgent activity to you, or does it look like professional interrogation techniques taught at the same schools where you learned to follow orders?" Martinez stepped closer, his tactical training warring with basic human decency as he saw the systematic torture marks on all three Marines. Burns from electrical devices, precisely placed cuts designed to cause maximum pain without fatal damage, and the kind of psychological abuse that spoke to intimate knowledge of American military psychology. Chen stirred against Emily's shoulder, his consciousness flickering but determined. "Martinez," he whispered, "Davidson is my captain's father. Family. Business." The revelation hit Martinez like physical blow. Emily could see him putting together pieces that painted a picture far different from his mission briefing. A father torturing his own son for information. Military resources used to cover up civilian crimes. Orders to execute children and veterans who had stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Above them, Davidson's patience finally snapped completely. Martinez, you have 10 seconds to complete your mission, or I will consider you a hostile force and eliminate you along with the targets. Emily watched Martinez's face harden as he realized his former commanding officer was threatening to murder him for showing basic human decency. The young soldier keyed his radio one final time. "Command, Bravo team is standing down. We will not fire on American civilians or wounded military personnel without proper authorization from Pentagon oversight." The response was immediate and terrifying. The helicopter gunship's chain gun began spinning up, its targeting system painting laser dots across the canyon floor. Davidson was preparing to eliminate everyone, his own forces, the Marines, Emily, and anyone else who could testify to what had happened here. "Take cover!" Martinez screamed, grabbing Emily and diving behind the boulder formation as the first burst of machine gun fire shattered rock where they'd been standing. The other tactical operators scattered, their training overriding their confusion as they sought protection from their own air support. Emily pressed herself against the ground, feeling rock fragments rain down like deadly hail. This was how it would end, not with justice or truth, but with overwhelming firepower destroying everyone who threatened Davidson's operation. Her father's investigation, Frank's sacrifice, the Marines' courage, all of it would be buried under official reports of insurgent activity and tragic friendly fire incidents. But then, cutting through the chaos of gunfire and screaming, came a sound that made Emily's heart soar with impossible hope. Max's bark, fierce and defiant, echoing from the direction of the highway. He had reached Frank's trailer. He had delivered the evidence. The old Vietnam Veterans Network was still operational. Davidson's voice over the radio carried a note of panic. "Martinez, destroy that trailer immediately. All units converge on the Morrison property." But Martinez was no longer taking orders from a man who had just tried to murder him. Instead, he was helping Emily and the wounded Marines reach better cover, while his team provided suppressing fire against the helicopter. "How long until real backup arrives?" Emily shouted over the noise. "Depends on who Frank contacted," Martinez replied, checking his ammunition. "Could be minutes, could be hours." They didn't have hours. The gunship was repositioning for another strafing run, and Davidson's ground forces were regrouping despite their moral crisis. Emily realized that survival depended on turning the tactical situation to their advantage, using the canyon terrain the way Apache warriors had once used it against overwhelming odds. "The drainage tunnel," she told Martinez. "It connects to the creek bed and comes out near the highway. If we can reach it, we can flank them." Rodriguez nodded weakly. Standard guerrilla tactics. Use their superior firepower against them by making them target terrain instead of personnel. Martinez looked at the 12-year-old girl who was proposing military strategy while under fire, and Emily could see him understanding why Michael Sullivan had been so proud of his daughter. She wasn't just a civilian to be protected. She was a tactical asset who knew this ground better than anyone. "Chen can't travel," Hayes pointed out, indicating the unconscious Marine whose injuries were beyond field treatment. Emily felt the weight of command decisions that no child should have to make. Leave Chen behind and he would certainly die. Take him with them and they might all die from moving too slowly. But as she looked at the young Marine, who had endured torture rather than betray his mission, she knew there was only one choice her father would have approved of. "We all go together or nobody goes," she said firmly. "Never leave a soldier behind." Martinez smiled grimly, recognizing the motto that had guided American military operations since World War II. "Roger that, ma'am. Bravo team, prepare for tactical movement with casualties. We're getting everyone out of here." Above them, the helicopter was lining up for another attack run, but Emily could hear something else in the distance. Other aircraft approaching from the east. The sound signature was different, heavier, more powerful. Whatever Frank's emergency beacon had summoned, it was big enough to challenge Davidson's gunships. As they prepared to move, Emily caught sight of Frank Morrison's still form lying in the desert dust. The old veteran had died protecting people he barely knew, continuing a mission that had cost him everything. She couldn't leave him for the buzzards and the cover-up crews. "Martinez, we need to take Frank's body. Emily, we can't carry—" "He's family," she said quietly, and something in her voice made the professional soldier nod without further argument. The race for salvation was about to begin, but this time they weren't running away from the truth. They were carrying it with them toward whatever justice might still exist in a world where good soldiers could be turned against each other by lies and corruption. In the distance, Max's howling mixed with the sound of approaching helicopters, creating a battle hymn for the final confrontation between honor and betrayal. This story reminds us that true heroism isn't found in Hollywood movies or history books. It lives in the quiet courage of everyday people who refuse to look away when others need help. Emily Sullivan, at just 12 years old, embodied the values that built our nation: loyalty, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe. Frank Morrison, a Vietnam veteran living on disability, proved that a warrior's heart never truly retires. Max, a broken dog with invisible scars, showed us that love can heal even the deepest wounds when we're needed most. For those of us who've served, who've raised children, who've watched our communities change, this story speaks to something eternal. The bonds that hold us together are stronger than the forces that try to tear us apart. In an age where cynicism seems easier than hope, Emily's story proves that one person's courage can still change everything. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness isn't a gun or a government program. It's a child who believes her grandfather's sacrifice meant something, and a community that refuses to let evil win. What moment in your own life reminded you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things? Have you ever had an animal companion who seemed to understand your pain better than most humans? Share your stories in the comments below. The sound of approaching helicopters grew thunderous as Emily helped Martinez and his team carry Frank's body toward the drainage tunnel. The old veteran's purple heart was clutched in his still fingers, and Emily made sure it stayed there. Frank Morrison would meet his maker wearing the medal he'd earned with blood and courage 50 years ago in a different war. "Contact bearing east-northeast," Martinez reported into his radio, watching the horizon through his tactical scope. "Multiple aircraft, heavy configuration. Looks like—" "Jesus Christ, those are Marine Corps Ospreys." Emily's heart leaped with desperate hope. The V-22 Osprey was the Marine Corps' premier assault transport, capable of carrying a full platoon of combat-ready Marines into hostile territory. If Frank's emergency beacon had reached the right people, real help was finally arriving. Rodriguez managed a weak smile despite his injuries. That's the sound of the cavalry, courtesy of one stubborn old soldier who knew how to call in favors. Above them, Davidson's helicopter gunship was pulling back, its pilot apparently recognizing the approaching aircraft as legitimate military forces. Emily could hear Davidson's voice over the radio, his tone shifting from commanding authority to desperate justification. "Inbound flight. This is Operation Blue Sand, conducting counterterrorism activities. Be advised we have confirmed insurgent activity in this sector." The response came in the crisp, professional tone of a Marine Corps officer who'd been briefed on the real situation. "Blue Sand? This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit. You are ordered to immediately cease fire and land for inspection. Frank Morrison was a personal friend, and we're here to collect what he died protecting." Emily felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood the full scope of what Frank had accomplished. The emergency beacon hadn't just called for help. It had summoned Marines who knew Frank personally, who understood his character and trusted his intelligence network. The old Vietnam veteran had built relationships that survived decades, creating a brotherhood that transcended rank and service branch. Davidson's voice crackled with barely controlled panic. "Colonel, you are interfering with a classified operation authorized at the highest levels. Stand down immediately or face consequences for obstruction of national security activities." "Marcus," Colonel Martinez replied, and Emily could hear personal history in her voice. "I served under you in Fallujah. You were a good officer then. But Frank Morrison sent me evidence of what you've become, and I'm here to bring you home before this gets any worse." Emily realized that even among Davidson's former colleagues, his transformation from decorated Marine to criminal had been noticed and documented. Frank's network included people who had served with Davidson, who remembered the man he used to be before grief and corruption consumed his soul. The first Osprey touched down on the canyon floor with precision that spoke to thousands of hours of combat experience. Marines poured out in full battle gear, but their weapons were lowered as they approached Emily's group. These weren't faceless government agents or corrupted contractors. These were professional soldiers responding to a call for help from a brother veteran. Emily Sullivan? The Marine sergeant approaching her looked like he could have served with her father. Young, competent, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd been tested in combat. "I'm Sergeant Williams. Colonel Martinez wants to speak with you personally." Emily looked at the micro SD card still attached to Max's collar through her father's dog tags. 3 years of investigation, dozens of lives lost, a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, all of it contained in a piece of technology smaller than her thumbnail. "The evidence is secure," she said, her 12-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been through combat. "But there are wounded Marines who need immediate medical attention." Williams nodded, signaling for Navy corpsmen who began treating Rodriguez, Chen, and Hayes with professional efficiency. Emily watched them work, remembering how Frank had taught her basic first aid using the same calm competence these medics displayed. Colonel Martinez approached personally, her silver hair catching the desert sun beneath her flight helmet. She was probably Frank's age, Emily realized, another member of the generation that had served in Vietnam and spent the rest of their lives watching over the warriors who came after them. "Miss Sullivan," Colonel Martinez said gently, removing her helmet to reveal eyes that held decades of military experience. "Frank Morrison saved my life in Da Nang in 1971. When his beacon activated yesterday, every Marine who ever served with him got the same message. Katie needs help." Emily felt the weight of understanding settle over her like a blanket. Frank hadn't just been investigating Davidson's network. He'd been building a counter-network of honest soldiers who would respond when corruption threatened to destroy everything they'd fought to protect. "He died protecting us," Emily said quietly, looking toward Frank's still form. "He died continuing my father's mission." "Then his sacrifice meant something," Colonel Martinez replied. "Because we're here, and we're going to make sure the truth comes out." Above them, Davidson's helicopter was being escorted down by Marine Corps fighters that had appeared from nowhere. Emily could see the moment when Davidson's pilot realized he was outgunned and outnumbered by forces that wouldn't be corrupted or intimidated. Max limped over to Emily's side, his amber eyes bright with intelligence despite his injuries. The German Shepherd had completed his mission: deliver the evidence, summon help, protect his pack until reinforcements arrived. Now he could finally rest, secure in the knowledge that his family was safe. Martinez knelt beside Max, recognizing the bearing of a military working dog. "This is the Shepherd that carried Frank's final transmission?" "Max served with my father in Afghanistan," Emily explained. "He's been protecting our family ever since Dad died." "Then he's earned a hero's welcome," Martinez said, signaling for a veterinary medic. "We take care of our own, 4 legs or 2. As Marines secured the canyon and began processing the crime scene, Emily found herself standing beside Rodriguez as corpsmen prepared him for medical evacuation. The young captain looked at her with eyes that held new respect, mixed with gratitude. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "You completed his mission when trained soldiers couldn't." Emily touched her father's dog tags, feeling the micro SD card that contained evidence powerful enough to bring down a network of corruption spanning multiple branches of government. But more than that, she felt the weight of family, not just blood relatives, but the chosen family of people who stood together when evil threatened to triumph. Frank Morrison lay at peace under the Arizona sun, his purple heart catching the light one final time. Sarah Sullivan arrived in a convoy of FBI vehicles, her face white with terror that transformed into overwhelming relief when she saw her daughter alive and whole. Max settled beside Emily as she was reunited with her mother, the German shepherd's mission finally complete. The old warrior had found his purpose again, proving that broken hearts could heal when they had something worth protecting. In the distance, Marcus Davidson was being taken into custody by Marines who had once served under his command. His corruption had been exposed, his network dismantled, but Emily felt no satisfaction in his downfall. Only sadness for a man who had let grief destroy everything he'd once stood for. The truth would come out now. Justice would be served. And somewhere in heaven, Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan could finally rest, knowing his daughter had proven that honor was stronger than corruption, that love could triumph over hate. Emily Sullivan had learned that heroes weren't born. They were made by ordinary people who refused to give up when others needed them most.